The American West wasn't just a place, it was a myth, a battlefield of truth and legend where history blurred into folklore. Hollywood often got it wrong, painting with cliches instead of reality. But sometimes the silver screen captured the grit, the dust, and the truth. Which westerns earned historians' respect, and why do they still haunt us today? Shane, 1953. When Shane hit theaters in 1953, audiences were already steeped in decades of romanticized cowboy tales. Yet George Stevens' film struck a different chord, quiet, deliberate, and deeply human. Critics hailed it as one of the most authentic westerns ever made, capturing the rugged conflict between homesteaders and open-range ranchers with rare nuance. At its heart, Shane isn't about shootouts, it's about survival and the fragile balance of frontier justice. Historians point to its careful recreation of settlement life, the sod houses, the backbreaking farm work, the looming fear of hired guns. Unlike earlier westerns, it refused to glorify violence. Even Shane's climactic duel carries a sense of grim inevitability rather than triumph. Behind the scenes, director George Stevens insisted on accuracy down to the smallest detail. He famously clashed with studio executives who wanted a faster, flashier picture. Stevens slowed everything down, using wide Wyoming landscapes to remind viewers of the West's immensity and isolation. Alan Ladd's performance as the weary gunfighter turned reluctant protector further anchored the story in a realism that felt lived in. The film's ending, with young Joey calling out to Shane as he rides away, perhaps mortally wounded, embodied the bittersweet truth of frontier life. Heroes seldom stay, and justice often comes at a terrible price. Historians still teach Shane as a masterclass in cinematic restraint, one that got the West right by embracing its melancholy. The Oxbow Incident, 1943. Long before revisionist westerns dominated the genre, the Oxbow Incident dared to strip away cowboy heroics and show frontier justice at its darkest. Released during World War II, the film bombed at the box office but stunned critics and later historians with its stark realism. The story follows a posse bent on vengeance, lynching 3 innocent men without trial. This wasn't the West of noble sheriffs or triumphant gunfights, it was mob rule, mistrust, and moral failure. Historians point to this as one of Hollywood's rare acknowledgments of how often lawlessness led to tragedy, not glory. Director William Wellman refused to soften the film's bleakness. The Nevada setting is claustrophobic, the dialogue sharp with moral tension. Henry Fonda, playing the reluctant cowboy haunted by guilt, carries the weight of the narrative. His closing reading of a letter from a wrongly hanged man is still considered one of the most devastating monologues in Western cinema. The studio nearly shelved the movie, fearing audiences wouldn't stomach its brutality. They were right. Wartime viewers wanted optimism, not moral reckoning. But historians later embraced the Oxbow Incident as one of the few westerns that dared to confront the consequences of frontier justice without hiding behind myth. This wasn't just a film. It was a warning that the West's violence often left blood on innocent hands. High Noon, 1952. When High Noon premiered, some critics dismissed it as just another town under siege story. But historians saw something more, a piercing allegory of isolation, morality, and the courage it takes to stand alone. Gary Cooper's Marshal Will Kane isn't a swaggering cowboy, he's an aging lawman abandoned by his community on the day he needs them most. As the clock ticks toward a gunfight with vengeful outlaws, Kane faces the West not as legend, but as a moral crucible. Historians praise High Noon for stripping away romanticism, exposing the fear and loneliness of frontier justice. Behind the scenes, the film was born from political defiance. Screenwriter Carl Foreman had been blacklisted during the Red Scare, and his script reflects that paranoia. Townsfolk too afraid to help, friends who vanish when courage is needed. Even John Wayne, America's cowboy idol, denounced the movie as un-American. Yet Cooper's performance, gaunt and weary, captured The quiet bravery, historians argue, was closer to real frontier lawmen than Hollywood's typical larger-than-life sheriffs. The use of real-time storytelling, with clocks constantly shown as the hour nears, gave the West an urgency rarely seen. And Dmitri Tiomkin's haunting score reminded viewers that duty often feels like a death march. High Noon endures because it dares to ask, what happens when the community refuses to stand for justice? Historians call it one of the truest Westerns, not because of its gunplay, but because of its silence, its fear, and its lonely integrity. My Darling Clementine, 1946. When John Ford released My Darling Clementine, the legend of Wyatt Earp and the gunfight at the OK Corral was already larger than life. But instead of turning the story into another dime novel shootout, Ford created a film steeped in quiet observation, ritual, and a textured sense of frontier life. The film's reputation grew slowly. Audiences admired it, but critics, especially historians, later called it one of the most authentic portrayals of Western society ever filmed. Yes, the details of the OK Corral are heavily fictionalized, but what mattered was how Ford captured the rhythms of the West. Dusty towns rising from nothing, lawmen torn between duty and survival, and the fragile humanity tucked between violence and loneliness. Henry Fonda's portrayal of Wyatt Earp broke away from the marble-tough archetype. His Earp is contemplative, hesitant, even awkward in moments of intimacy. Historians highlight scenes like the church dance under the open sky, which revealed the community's yearning for civility amid the chaos of frontier life. That moment wasn't in any history book, but it told the truth about human longing for order on a lawless edge of America. Behind the camera, Ford drew inspiration from his own conversations with the real Wyatt Earp decades earlier. Though historians debate those claims, they agree Ford pursued atmosphere over myth. His Monument Valley vistas became more than scenery. They were characters themselves, dwarfing men and reminding audiences of the West's brutal vastness. In the end, My Darling Clementine gave the West a heartbeat. Instead of glamorizing gunfire, it lingered on moments of silence, ritual, and fragile community. Historians say it got it right, not in its facts, but in its soul. Unforgiven, 1992. By the early 1990 seconds, Westerns had fallen out of fashion, dismissed as outdated relics. Then Clint Eastwood unleashed Unforgiven, a film that dismantled every cowboy myth while honoring the genre's deepest truths. It wasn't just a hit, it was a reckoning. Public reception was electric. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, and historians praised its unflinching honesty. The film follows William Money, a once merciless outlaw now trying to live quietly, pulled back into violence against his will. What set it apart was how it stripped away the glamour of gunfights. Every act of violence is messy, awkward, and sickeningly real. Eastwood, who once embodied the stoic gunslinger in spaghetti westerns, deliberately deconstructed his own myth. Historians call Unforgiven the last great Western because it forced audiences to see the West as it truly was, bloody, uncertain, and filled with men broken by their choices. Behind the scenes, Eastwood guarded the script for over a decade, waiting until he was old enough to embody Money's weathered soul. Gene Hackman's chilling role as Little Bill Daggett added another layer of realism, a lawman who abuses power as easily as the outlaws he hunts. The Academy crowned Unforgiven with 4 Oscars, including Best Picture, yet historians emphasize that its real achievement was moral clarity. The West wasn't heroic. It was unforgiving, and Eastwood finally made Hollywood admit it. The Searchers, 1956. At first glance, John Ford's The Searchers looks like another sweeping cowboy epic. But beneath its Monument Valley beauty lies a brutal meditation on race, obsession, and the true scars of frontier life. Today, historians call it one of the most complex westerns ever made. When it premiered, audiences admired its scale, but many missed its darker undercurrents. John Wayne's Ethan Edwards is no heroic cowboy. He's a bitter, racist Civil War veteran obsessed with rescuing his kidnapped niece, even if it means killing her for going native. Historians argue that this portrait of prejudice was far closer to real frontier tensions than the sanitized tales Hollywood usually told. Ford, himself often accused of myth-making, shocked critics with the rawness of his imagery. The Texas frontier isn't romanticized here, it's harsh, bloody, and morally tangled. Even Wayne's towering performance unsettles historians. Note it may be the most layered role of his career, exposing the cruelty that often accompanied westward expansion. Behind the scenes, the film was controversial even among its cast. Some feared audiences weren't ready to see Wayne play such a flawed, angry character. Yet Ford pushed forward, using the story to reflect America's darker truths about race and conquest. The closing shot, Ethan framed in a doorway, forever outside the home he fought to protect, remains one of cinema's most haunting images. For historians, The Searchers got it right, not by celebrating the West, but by showing how it consumed the men who lived it. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973. When Sam Peckinpah's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid first hit theaters, critics panned it as chaotic, disjointed, and even unfinished. But over the decades, historians came to see it as one of the most authentic westerns ever made, a meditation on the dying West, corruption, and loyalty turned sour. The film was born into turmoil. Peckinpah, already infamous for clashing with studios, fought Warner Brothers over budget, length, and final cut. The studio butchered his original vision, releasing a choppy version that confused audiences. Yet even in its flawed form, something raw and undeniable came through. The exhaustion of men clinging to an era that was slipping away. Historians point to Peckinpah's insistence on historical grit. James Coburn's Pat Garrett isn't a noble sheriff, but a weary, compromised man forced to kill his former friend, Billy the Kid. Kris Kristofferson, though older than the real outlaw, captured Billy's charisma and fatal charm. Bob Dylan, who not only acted but contributed the haunting score Knockin' on Heaven's Door, added a ghostly echo to the tale. Unlike earlier westerns that glorified the chase, Peckinpah framed the West as already dying, poisoned by greed, politics, and betrayal. The film's violence isn't stylized heroism, but messy, weary, and inevitable. Historians argue that in showing the end of the outlaw era as tragedy rather than triumph, Peckinpah got closer to the truth than almost anyone. Today, restored cuts reveal a mournful masterpiece. The West, it reminds us, didn't die in glory, it bled out in betrayal and silence. Little Big Man, 1970. By 1970, America was questioning its own myths, and Little Big Man exploded onto the scene as the anti-Western that rewrote the genre. Starring Dustin Hoffman as Jack Crabb, a white man raised by Cheyenne Indians who later drifts between cultures, the film challenged nearly every Hollywood stereotype of Native Americans and frontiersmen. Historians hail it as groundbreaking, because it dared to mock the tall tales that shaped America's view of the West. General Custer is portrayed not as a tragic hero, but as a delusional egotist marching his men to certain death. Native American life is shown with respect and complexity, far removed from the cardboard savages of earlier films. Behind the scenes, director Arthur Penn fought hard to balance satire with historical resonance. He wanted audiences to laugh at the absurdities of Western myth while still feeling the tragedy of conquest. Hoffman, buried under old-age makeup to narrate the tale, gave one of his most ambitious performances, moving from comedy to heartbreak with ease. When it premiered, the film divided. Critics, some saw it as too irreverent, while others recognized its daring honesty. Over time, historians embraced it as one of the most culturally accurate depictions of native settler relations in mainstream cinema. In the end, Little Big Man got it right, not by sticking to dates or battles, but by shattering the lies that built the cowboy legend. It showed the West as a place of survivors, tricksters, and broken dreams. The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford, 2007. Upon release, Andrew Dominik's The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford was praised for its beauty but criticized for its slow pace. Audiences expecting a fast-paced outlaw saga found instead a haunting meditation on celebrity, betrayal, and myth-making. Historians, however, hailed it as one of the truest westerns of the modern era. Brad Pitt's Jesse James isn't a heroic bandit, he's paranoid, violent, and wearied by his own legend. Casey Affleck's Robert Ford is no cartoon villain, but a young man crushed under the weight of admiration and envy. Historians note the film's meticulous attention to detail, authentic period clothing, dialect, and the psychological weight of living under constant danger. Roger Deakins' cinematography turned landscapes into memory, with frost-tipped fields and gas-lit interiors evoking the West's haunting transience. Behind the scenes, Pitt championed the film against studio hesitation, even as Warner Brothers worried its meditative pace would alienate audiences. The truth is, Jesse James was no Robin Hood. He was a violent outlaw who inspired both fear and fascination. Dominik's film understood that better than most, showing how legends are built on blood and betrayal. Historians argue it captured the essence of how myth devoured the real West. Its final scenes, Ford shot on stage for killing his idol, force audiences to confront the hollowness of fame. In doing so, the film strips away every illusion, leaving only the truth. The West was never about glory. It was about survival, envy, and the terrible cost of living in someone else's shadow. Dances with Wolves, 1990. When Dances with Wolves premiered in 1990, few expected a 3-hour Western directed by and starring Kevin Costner to change cinematic history. Yet it did. Not only was it a massive box office success, but historians and cultural critics alike praised it for shattering stereotypes and presenting Native American life with unprecedented respect in mainstream Hollywood. The film follows Union officer John Dunbar, who becomes disillusioned with war and finds unexpected kinship with the Lakota Sioux. What made it revolutionary was its portrayal of Native Americans not as faceless antagonists, but as richly developed characters with culture, humor, and dignity. Costner insisted on authenticity. Lakota dialogue was spoken in the tribe's own language, with subtitles an unheard-of decision at the time. Historians praise this as a milestone in giving voice to indigenous people on screen. Behind the scenes, the film was nearly doomed. Studios balked at the budget, the length, and the fact that Costner was an untested director. They called it Costner's Folly. But Costner pushed forward, filming in South Dakota with meticulous attention to detail, even down to traditional clothing, food preparation, and the use of actual tribal members as actors. When the film swept the Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director, it wasn't just a victory for Costner. It was a moment of recognition that the West was far more complex than the one-dimensional myths Hollywood had been selling for decades. Historians continue to regard it as a turning point, one that got it right by showing the West through the eyes of those too often silenced. Hell on Wheels, 2011-2016, though not a feature film but a television series, Hell on Wheels carved its place as one of the most historically faithful portrayals of the American West ever produced. Set during the construction of the first transcontinental railroad, the series follows former Confederate soldier Cullen Bohannon as he drifts into a lawless, dangerous world defined by ambition and greed. Historians lauded the show for capturing the railroad's brutal reality. Unlike glossy Western myths, Hell on Wheels exposed the backbreaking labor, the rampant exploitation of Irish and Chinese workers, and the violent displacements of native tribes. It also peeled back the layers of corruption in railroad companies, showing how wealth and power were built on the suffering of others. The series also excelled in portraying the diversity of frontier life, something Hollywood often ignored. Freedmen seeking opportunity after the Civil War, immigrants carving out fragile new lives, and indigenous people fighting against encroachment were all given voices. The result was a mosaic of the West that reflected its complexity rather than erasing it. Behind the scenes, production was praised for its historical accuracy in costumes, sets, and dialects. The mud-caked camps, the harsh winters, and the sheer chaos of life around a mobile railroad town offered viewers a West that felt tactile and real. While it never reached blockbuster ratings, Hell on Wheels has been embraced by historians as one of the most educational Western narratives on screen. It got the West right by refusing to look away from its dirt, its greed, and its fractured humanity. Deadwood 2004, 2006, 2019 film. If most Westerns dealt in myth, Deadwood tore those myths apart and left nothing but raw history, profanity, and humanity in their place. Premiering on HBO in 2004, the series shocked audiences with its unflinching realism, but historians quickly recognized it as one of the truest depictions of frontier life ever attempted. Set in the lawless mining camp of Deadwood, South Dakota, the show revolved around real historical figures like Al Swearingen, Wild Bill Hickok, and Calamity Jane. What set it apart was not just accuracy of names or events, but the granular attention to how frontier communities actually functioned, messy, violent, and fueled by money. Creator David Milch worked closely with historical records, weaving authentic details into the dialogue and storylines. Even the language, laced with Shakespearean rhythm and vulgarity, was designed to reflect the rough poetry of 19th-century speech. The mud-slick streets, the fragile alliances, and the constant sense that law and order were inventions built on shifting sands, all of it rang true. Behind the scenes, the series struggled with budget battles and ultimately ended too soon. Yet its legacy grew, culminating in the 2019 Deadwood film that gave closure to its characters. Historians argue the show remains unparalleled in its depiction of the West as a place not of clean morality, but of survival, compromise, and ruthless ambition. Deadwood got it right because it didn't seek to glorify. It sought to expose, and in doing so, it revealed the West as it truly was: foul, fragile, and frighteningly human. Jeremiah Johnson, 1972. When Jeremiah Tend Yourself and Johnson premiered in 1972, audiences were captivated by its rugged beauty and Robert Redford's stoic performance. But historians found something deeper, one of the most faithful depictions of the American mountain man era ever put to screen. The film tells the story of a disillusioned Mexican-American war veteran who retreats into the Rocky Mountains, seeking solitude but finding hardship at every turn. What made it remarkable was its commitment to portraying survival with authenticity. Redford's character nearly starves, learns from native tribes, and faces brutal winters mirroring the recorded experiences of real trappers and frontiersmen of the 19th century. Historians often praise its attention to detail, the use of flintlock rifles, authentic trapping techniques, and the depiction of tense but respectful exchanges with indigenous peoples. Unlike older Westerns, Jeremiah Johnson didn't cast Native Americans as faceless enemies, but showed both cooperation and conflict as part of frontier life. Behind the scenes, director Sidney Pollack battled extreme weather in Utah's Wasatch Mountains, sometimes forcing cast and crew to endure the same bitter cold as the characters. Redford, fully committed, insisted on doing much of the survival work himself, gutting fish, carrying heavy loads, and trudging through snow. This realism translated onto the screen, giving the film a tactile authenticity. Though critics were divided at first, Jeremiah Johnson has since become a historian's favorite, often shown in classrooms as an accurate reflection of mountain man life. The West wasn't just about gunfights and saloons, it was about endurance, solitude, and the price of freedom in a land both beautiful and merciless. Tombstone, 1993. Few films have been as mythologized and scrutinized by historians as Tombstone. Released in 1993, it was a commercial success and quickly became a cult favorite thanks to its star-studded cast and endlessly quotable lines. But what often goes unnoticed is how close it came to capturing the historical essence of the OK Corral saga. Kurt Russell's Wyatt Earp and Val Kilmer's haunting portrayal of Doc Holliday may not have been perfect recreations, but they tapped into the real emotional truths of these men. Kilmer's Holliday, in particular, has been praised by historians for embodying the gambler's brilliance, charm, and fatal illness with eerie accuracy. Unlike earlier Hollywood versions, Tombstone leaned heavily on historical records. Many of its events, the infamous gunfight, the Earp Vendetta ride, were depicted with surprising fidelity. The costumes, weapons, and even the town's muddy streets reflected deep research. Historians especially commend the film's inclusion of less glamorous realities, corruption, greed, and the fragile nature of law in a booming mining town. The production itself was a battle. Director George P. Cosmatos was brought in mid-shoot after the original director clashed with the studio. Kurt Russell later revealed he essentially ghost-directed much of the film, shaping its pacing and character arcs. Despite the chaos, the final product struck a rare balance, entertaining mainstream audiences while still satisfying historians looking for accuracy. "I'm your Huckleberry," Kilmer drawls, sealing Holliday's legend. Historians argue the line captures the wit and fatalism of a man who knew he was already dying. Tombstone may dramatize, but it also respects. And that's why it got it right. Lonesome Dove, 1989. When Larry McMurtry's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Lonesome Dove was adapted into a television miniseries in 1989, many doubted a TV Western could achieve greatness. Instead, it delivered what historians call one of the most authentic and sweeping portrayals of the West ever filmed. Starring Robert Duvall as Gus McCrae and Tommy Lee Jones as Woodrow Call, two retired Texas Rangers leading cattle drive from Texas to Montana, the miniseries combined historical accuracy with deeply human storytelling. Historians praised its depiction of the grueling realities of cattle drives, storms, disease, Indian raids, and the sheer exhaustion of moving thousands of animals across untamed country. What made it groundbreaking was its scope. Unlike 2-hour films, the 6-hour runtime allowed it to explore frontier life in detail, showing not only gunfights but also the quiet moments of camaraderie, tragedy, and survival. Women and Native Americans were not treated as afterthoughts but as integral to the story, giving a fuller picture of the West's diversity and hardship. Behind the scenes, the production committed to authenticity. Real cattle were driven across miles of land, and actors endured the same weather as their characters. Duvall's performance as Gus, a man full of humor, charm, and eventual tragedy, was hailed as career-defining, embodying the contradictions of the West itself. The miniseries became a cultural phenomenon, winning 7 Emmy Awards and captivating millions of viewers. Historians continue to regard it as a definitive screen western, one that got it right by portraying the West as a place of both grandeur and relentless struggle. The American West was never simple. It was a place of hardship, betrayal, and fragile hope. These westerns tore away the myths and showed us history's true face. Which one spoke to you most? Share your thoughts below and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the conversation.